The rich man's son wouldn't speak or look at anyone, but the beggar did the unthinkable. Richard Sullivan was pacing nervously in the clinic's waiting room, his Italian leather shoes making noise against the cold floor. Another appointment, another hope that would turn into frustration. His son Michael, just 8 years old, was sitting in the corner of the room, staring fixedly at the floor, as if the world around him simply didn't exist. The boy hadn't uttered a word in almost 2 years. He wouldn't look anyone in the eye, didn't respond when called, showed no interest in anything. Richard had already consulted the best neurologists in New York City, renowned child psychiatrists, specialized therapists. He had spent a fortune on tests, treatments, private sessions. Nothing worked. "Mr. Sullivan?" The receptionist called him in a soft voice. "Dr. Stephen can see you now." Richard approached his son and gently touched his shoulder. Michael didn't even blink. With a heavy sigh, the father held the boy's tiny, cold hand, leading him to yet another appointment that he already knew would be useless. Dr. Stephen Parker's office was spacious and well decorated, with diplomas on the walls attesting to decades of experience. The doctor, a man with graying hair and stylish glasses, observed Michael for a few minutes while the boy remained motionless in the chair like a porcelain doll. "Mr. Sullivan, we've talked about this several times," said the doctor, adjusting his glasses. "Michael presents a condition we call selective mutism, associated with a possible autism spectrum. Unfortunately, there is no miracle cure. What we can do is continue with behavioral therapies and wait." "Wait for what?" Richard interrupted, his voice laden with desperation. "Doctor, my son was a normal child. He talked, played, laughed. After the accident, he just shut down. There has to be something we can do." The doctor sighed, showing the same expression Richard had seen on so many other professionals. It was the expression of someone who had exhausted all possibilities. "I understand your anguish, Mr. Sullivan. Losing his mother at 6 years old is an immense trauma for any child. But sometimes we need to accept that the child's mind has its own defense mechanisms. Michael might be processing the pain in his own way." Richard looked at his son, who remained oblivious to the conversation, idly fiddling with the buttons on the navy blue blazer he was wearing. Always elegantly dressed, always impeccable, always empty. Leaving the clinic, Richard decided to walk to the office. He needed fresh air to clear his mind and think about the next step. Michael walked beside him, maintaining the same mechanical pace, looking only at the sidewalk in front of him. They passed by Union Square in downtown New York City when Richard noticed a man sitting on the steps of the central statue. He was a beggar, apparently in his 50s, with worn but clean clothes, a wool beanie covering his graying hair. What caught Richard's attention was the fact that the man was making strange movements with his hands, as if he were talking to someone invisible. Michael, for the first time in months, slowed his pace. He didn't stop completely, but Richard noticed the boy's eyes briefly strayed in the man's direction. It was just a second, but for a desperate father, any reaction was a miracle. "Let's go, Michael," said Richard, gently pulling his son's hand. "We need to get to the office." But as they walked away, Richard noticed that Michael turned his head to look back one more time, as if something had sparked his curiosity. It was the first time in almost 2 years that the boy had shown interest in something from the outside world. That night, Richard couldn't get the scene out of his head. While Michael slept in his bed, surrounded by expensive toys he never used, Richard Sullivan thought about the look his son had directed at that man in the square. Was there something there that the doctors couldn't offer? Was it possible that a homeless man had the key that the country's best specialists couldn't find? The next morning, Richard made a decision that his business friends would consider insane. Instead of taking Michael directly to the private school where he studied, he made a detour through Union Square. To his surprise, the same man was there, sitting in the same spot, making the same strange hand gestures. Michael again slowed his pace, and this time Richard allowed them to stop at a safe distance. The boy didn't look directly at the man, but his body posture had changed. He was more attentive, less mechanical. "Excuse me." Richard approached the homeless man, keeping a respectful tone. "My name is Richard Sullivan. This is my son, Michael." The man raised his eyes, and Richard was surprised by the intelligence he saw in them. They weren't the empty eyes of someone lost in life, but deep eyes, filled with experience, and, curiously, with a familiar sadness. "Daniel Matthews," the man introduced himself, standing up politely. "It's a pleasure to meet you. Well, this might seem strange, but yesterday my son showed interest in what you were doing with your hands." Daniel looked at Michael, who continued to look at the ground, but Richard could swear the boy was paying attention to the conversation. "Ah, that," Daniel smiled gently. "It's sign language. I was, well, talking to a friend who is no longer here." The simplicity of the answer touched Richard in a way he didn't expect. There was a raw honesty in those words that contrasted with the technical terms and complex explanations he heard from the doctors. "My son, he hasn't spoken for almost 2 years," Richard confessed, surprised by his own openness with a stranger. "He lost his mother in an accident and has completely shut down since then." Daniel nodded slowly, as if he perfectly understood the situation. His eyes turned to Michael again, but unlike the doctors who tried to force eye contact, Daniel simply observed respectfully. "Sometimes words are too heavy to carry," Daniel said, his voice full of understanding. "Especially when the pain is too great. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing." Richard felt a shiver run down his spine. There was something in that man's words that resonated in a way medical explanations never had. It was as if Daniel spoke a language that Michael could understand, even in his silence. "Do you have experience with children?" Richard asked, still trying to understand why he felt this meeting wasn't just a coincidence. "I did," Daniel replied simply, and Richard noticed a shadow pass over his eyes. "A long time ago." At that moment, Michael did something he hadn't done in months. He slightly raised his head and looked in Daniel's direction. It wasn't a direct look, but it was a conscious, intentional movement. Richard held his breath. Daniel noticed the movement, and without making a fuss began the hand gestures again. This time Richard noticed they were slow, deliberate, almost hypnotic movements. Michael followed the gestures with his eyes, his first voluntary visual reaction in almost 2 years. "Michael," Richard whispered, moved. "Michael, are you seeing this?" But the moment Richard spoke, Michael lowered his head again and withdrew. Daniel made a subtle gesture for Richard not to insist. "Pressure scares," Daniel explained quietly. "He's connected, but he needs time and space." Richard understood immediately. For all these months, he and the doctors had tried to force Michael to react, to speak, to respond. But Daniel was offering something different: patience. "Could we come back here tomorrow?" Richard asked, feeling both hopeful and ridiculous for asking advice from a man who lived on the street. "I'll be here," Daniel replied. "I always am." On the way to school, Michael held himself slightly differently. He still didn't speak, still didn't look at his father, but there was a quality to his silence that seemed less empty, less desperate. Richard spent the entire day at the office thinking about the encounter. His partners noticed his distraction during meetings, but he didn't know how to explain that he was pinning his hopes on a homeless man making strange gestures in a public square. That night, Richard researched sign language on the internet. He discovered it was a complex and complete method of communication, used primarily by people with hearing impairments. Why would a homeless man know sign language? And why had Michael shown interest in just that? The next morning, Richard again took Michael to the square. Daniel was there, as promised, and this time Richard noticed he had a small backpack beside him, carefully organized. "Good morning, Michael," Daniel greeted the boy directly, ignoring the social protocol of speaking to the father first. "I brought something to show you." From inside the backpack, Daniel took out a small illustrated book about animals. It wasn't an expensive or sophisticated book, but it was well kept. He opened it to the first page and began to talk to the book using sign language, as if he were telling the story to the drawings. Michael, once again, followed the movements with his eyes. This time, Richard forced himself to stay quiet and just observe. Daniel turned the page and continued his silent conversation. On the third page, which showed a dog, Michael made an almost imperceptible movement with his right hand. It was a clumsy, incomplete gesture, but it was clearly an attempt to imitate Daniel's movements. Richard felt tears begin to form in his eyes. It was the first time in almost 2 years that Michael had tried to communicate in any way. Daniel saw the gesture and smiled subtly, but made no comment. He simply continued his silent story, allowing Michael to participate at his own pace. After about 20 minutes, Richard knew they needed to go to school. When they got up to leave, Michael did something surprising. He waved timidly at Daniel before walking away. "See you tomorrow, Michael," Daniel responded, returning the wave. In the car on the way to school, Richard was euphoric. He immediately called Dr. Stephen to tell him about the progress, but the doctor's reaction was cautious. "Mr. Sullivan, I understand your excitement, but I must warn you about getting your hopes up too high. Children with Michael's condition can have moments of temporary improvement that don't necessarily indicate real progress. Furthermore, we know nothing about this man. It could be dangerous." "Doctor, I saw my son react," Richard interrupted. "For the first time in 2 years, he showed interest in something." "I understand, but I recommend caution. If you want to continue these meetings, I suggest you do so under professional supervision." Richard hung up the phone, frustrated. Why did the doctors always seem more interested in destroying hope than in cultivating it? For the rest of the week, Richard and Michael visited Daniel every day. With each meeting, Michael became a little more receptive. He began to imitate more gestures, started to turn the pages of the book along with Daniel, and even smiled slightly when Daniel made the sign for funny. Richard also began to learn some basic signs. Daniel patiently taught him simple words like "thank you," "good morning," and "friend." It was emotional when Michael chuckled softly, seeing his father clumsily trying to form the words with his hands. By the end of the week, Richard felt comfortable enough to ask the question that had intrigued him since the first day. "Daniel, how did you learn sign language?" The man was quiet for a moment, looking at his own hands. When he answered, his voice carried the weight of painful memories. "My daughter was born deaf," he said simply. "I learned so I could talk with her." Richard felt a tightness in his chest. "Where is she now?" "She's not here anymore," Daniel replied, and Richard understood he shouldn't press the matter. But the revelation explained a lot. Daniel wasn't just a homeless man making random gestures. He was a father who had learned a special language to communicate with his daughter, and now he was using that language to reach another boy lost in his own world of silence. That night, Richard couldn't sleep. He began to question his own relationship with Michael. Since losing his wife, he had focused on finding medical solutions, expensive treatments, renowned specialists. But when was the last time he simply sat with his son and tried to understand his world instead of trying to change it? The next morning, Saturday, Richard decided to spend more time in the square. He had no work commitments and could better observe the interaction between Michael and Daniel. They arrived at the square around 9 in the morning. Daniel was already there, but this time he wasn't alone. An elderly lady, well-dressed but with a melancholy air, was sitting beside him on the bench. She carried a large bag and seemed to be offering Daniel something to eat. "Good morning," Richard greeted them both politely. "Richard, Michael, I want you to meet Mrs. Eleanor." Daniel made the introductions. "She brought me breakfast." Mrs. Eleanor smiled warmly. "Daniel told me about you. It's wonderful to see a child learning sign language." "You know it too?" Richard asked. "My grandson is deaf," she explained. "I've lived with him since my daughter. Well, since it was just me left to raise him. I come here every morning for a walk and I always see Daniel. We discovered we have a lot in common." Richard realized a small community was forming around these morning meetings. Mrs. Eleanor brought her grandson, a boy of about 10 named Ethan, to meet Michael. Ethan communicated fluently in sign language and, to everyone's surprise, Michael showed great interest in watching him. It was different from when he watched Daniel. With Ethan, there was a natural connection between two children. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like the video and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. Ethan taught Michael some basic signs specific to children. Play, cool, friend. And for the first time since the accident, Richard saw Michael genuinely interested in something. The boy paid full attention to Ethan's signs, trying to imitate them with growing confidence. "He's learning fast," commented Mrs. Eleanor. "Ethan said Michael has a natural talent for it." Richard felt overwhelmed with emotion. His son, who doctors had diagnosed as possibly autistic and unable to form social connections, was clearly relating to other people through sign language. That afternoon, Richard made a decision that would change everything. He hired a private sign language teacher to have lessons at home with Michael. When he told Dr. Stephen about the progress and his plans, the reaction was even more skeptical. "Mr. Sullivan, I understand you're seeing improvements, but sign language is not a recognized treatment for selective mutism. Michael needs to start speaking verbally again. If he gets too used to gestural communication, he might settle in and never try to verbalize again." "Doctor, for the first time in 2 years, my son is communicating. It doesn't matter if it's through gestures or words. He's becoming a child again. I understand your perspective, but as a professional, I must warn you that you might be delaying Michael's true recovery." Richard left the office determined to trust his paternal instincts more than medical protocols. Michael was clearly getting better, and that was all that mattered. The sign language teacher, Rachel Collins, came to the Sullivan house 3 times a week. She was a young, energetic woman who worked with deaf children at a specialized school. She was impressed by how quickly Michael absorbed the new vocabulary. "He has a natural intuition for this," she commented to Richard after the 3rd lesson. "It usually takes months for a hearing child to reach this level of fluency. Michael is learning it in weeks." During the lessons, Michael began to show a personality that Richard had forgotten existed. The boy laughed when Rachel told jokes in signs, asked questions through gestures about things he saw through the window, and even started to tell his own stories using the signs he was learning. But the most impressive thing happened in the 4th week of lessons. Michael was practicing the sign language alphabet when he suddenly stopped and looked directly at Richard. It was the first time in almost 2 years that they had made direct eye contact. "Daddy," Michael signed. It was the first time he had addressed his father since the accident. Richard felt tears streaming freely down his face. "Hi, my son," he replied in signs, hugging Michael with all his strength. Rachel discreetly stepped away to give them privacy. It was clear something very special was happening in that house. That night, Richard called his sister Jennifer, who lived in Los Angeles. She had been very close to Michael before the accident and was devastated when she learned her nephew had stopped speaking. "Jen, I have to tell you something amazing." Richard could barely contain his excitement. "Michael has started communicating again." "What do you mean? Is he talking again?" "Not exactly, but he's using sign language, and today he made eye contact with me and called me Daddy." Jennifer was silent for a moment before starting to cry on the other end of the line. "Richard, I knew he would come back. I always knew. I want you to come visit us. Michael needs to see he still has family who loves him. Of course, I'll schedule a trip for next weekend." Richard spent the rest of the night thinking about how life had changed in the last few weeks. It all started with a chance encounter with a homeless man in a square. And now Michael was slowly returning to being the affectionate, intelligent boy he was before the tragedy. The next morning, Richard and Michael went to the square to share the good news with Daniel. They found him in his usual spot, but he seemed different, quieter, more thoughtful. "Good morning, Daniel," Richard greeted him. "Michael has some news for you." Michael approached Daniel and, with the signs he had learned, told him about his lessons, about Rachel, and about how he had called his father Daddy for the first time. Daniel followed along attentively, smiling genuinely. "I'm very proud of you," Daniel signed to Michael. "You are a very brave boy." Michael smiled and ran to hug Daniel. It was a moment of pure joy, but Richard noticed something melancholy in the man's eyes. "Is everything all right?" Richard asked, when Michael ran off to play with some pigeons. "You won't need me anymore," Daniel said simply. "Michael has found his way." Richard felt a knot in his stomach. "Daniel, you're not thinking of leaving, are you?" "We don't belong to the same world, Richard. You're a successful businessman. Michael is a smart boy with his whole life ahead of him. I'm just a man who lost everything and is living on the streets. Don't say that. You saved my son. You saved our family. Daniel shook his head. I just showed Michael that there are other ways to communicate. You did the rest. That night, Richard couldn't get the conversation out of his head. There was something about Daniel's melancholy that bothered him. The man had given so much to them, but Richard knew very little about his personal story. The next day, Richard made a decision that his business friends would consider completely insane. He hired a private investigator to find out more about Daniel Matthews. What the investigator discovered a week later left Richard shocked. Daniel wasn't just an ordinary homeless man. 15 years ago, he had been Dr. Daniel Matthews, a respected pediatrician specializing in child development who worked at one of the top hospitals in New York City. He had a deaf daughter, Emily, whom he was raising alone after separating from his wife. They were very close, and Daniel had dedicated himself to learning sign language to communicate with her. Emily was a bright child, a talented artist who dreamed of studying art in Europe. The tragedy happened when Emily was 17. She was coming back from a dance performance when she was hit by a drunk driver. She spent 3 months in a coma before passing away. Daniel never recovered from the loss. He started drinking, lost his medical license, completely separated from family and friends. Within a few years, he lost his home, his possessions, and ended up living on the streets. The last 10 years he had spent wandering the city, surviving on odd jobs and the kindness of strangers. Richard was devastated reading the report. Daniel had lost a daughter in the same way that Michael had lost his mother, but his pain had been far more destructive, and yet he had found the strength to help another father and another son lost in their own pain. Richard spent days thinking about what to do with this information. He couldn't just confront Daniel with his past, but he also couldn't pretend he didn't know. The answer came when Michael asked a question Richard didn't expect. "Dad," Michael signed during dinner, "why is Daniel always sad?" Richard was surprised by his son's perception. "Why do you think he's sad?" "His eyes," Michael explained through signs. "They're like yours when you look at Mom's picture." The child's observation was like a punch to Richard's stomach. Michael had identified something he himself was trying to process. Daniel carried the same weight of loss that they knew well. "Would you like to help Daniel?" Richard asked. Michael nodded vigorously. "Then we have to think of something special." That night, Richard had an idea. He called Rachel Collins and asked if she knew of any school or institution that worked with deaf children and might need an experienced consultant. "Actually, I do," Rachel answered. "The school where I work is looking for someone to help develop new teaching methods for deaf children who also have other special needs. Why do you ask?" Richard briefly explained about Daniel, obviously omitting specific details about his medical past. "It would be perfect," Rachel said excitedly. "Someone with practical experience communicating with deaf children and the sensitivity to handle trauma would be exactly what we need." Richard spent the next few days working out a plan. First, he needed to convince Daniel to accept the help. Second, I needed to find a way to reintegrate him into society without hurting his pride. The opportunity came when Jennifer arrived for her visit. Michael was extremely excited to show his aunt everything he had learned. She was moved to see her nephew chatting animatedly in signs, telling her about his days, his new friends, about Daniel. "Richard, it's a miracle," she said, hugging her brother. "Michael is completely different." "It's all thanks to Daniel," Richard explained, "but now I need your help to repay him." Richard told Jennifer about Daniel's past and his plan. She immediately offered to help. On Saturday, they all went to the square together, Richard, Michael, and Jennifer. Daniel was there as always, but he seemed even more melancholic than the previous week. "Daniel, I want you to meet my sister, Jennifer." Richard made the introductions. Jennifer greeted Daniel warmly and began talking to him about sign language, about Michael, about what it was like to work with children. She had a natural way of making people feel comfortable. After an hour of conversation, Richard finally decided to broach the subject. "Daniel, can I ask you a personal question?" "Of course." "Have you ever thought about going back to work with children?" Daniel visibly became uncomfortable. "Richard, my situation is complicated." "I know about Emily," Richard said gently. The silence that followed was heavy and painful. Daniel looked at Richard with a mixture of shock and pain. "How?" "It doesn't matter how I found out. What matters is that you saved my son using the exact experience you gained from being Emily's father." Tears began to stream down Daniel's face. "I didn't save anyone. I couldn't even save my own daughter." "Daniel," Jennifer intervened softly, "can I ask you a question? What would Emily want you to do now?" The question took Daniel by surprise. He was quiet for a long moment, clearly thinking. She always said I had a gift for helping children," he finally replied. "She said I understood children in a way other doctors didn't." "And she was right," Richard said. "You proved that with Michael." Michael, who had been playing nearby, approached and held Daniel's hand. Through signs, he said something no one expected. "You taught me that it's okay to miss Mom. Now I want to teach you that it's okay to miss Emily. But she would want you to help other children." The simple wisdom of an 8-year-old touched something deep in Daniel. He hugged Michael and cried openly, releasing years of pent-up pain. "I have a proposal for you," Richard said when Daniel had composed himself. "I know a school that needs someone with your experience. It's not charity, it's a job. You would earn enough to get back on your feet." "Richard, I don't have a medical license anymore. I don't have updated documents. I don't even have a permanent address." "We can sort all that out," Jennifer said. "I work as a lawyer in Los Angeles. I can help with the legal part, and you can stay in the guest apartment at our house while you get organized." Daniel looked at them as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Why would you do this for me?" "Because you gave me back my son," Richard answered simply. "And because I believe Emily would be proud to see you helping other children." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like the video, and especially to subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. Daniel's reintegration process was neither easy nor quick. Jennifer spent 2 weeks in New York City, helping with the documentation, the necessary medical and psychological consultations, and mainly offering emotional support. Daniel stayed in the guest apartment of Richard's house, which was on the ground floor and had a private entrance. At first he felt uncomfortable with the luxury surrounding him, but Michael helped him adapt by showing him around the house and introducing him to his toys using signs. The first week was difficult. Daniel had frequent nightmares and anxiety attacks. Richard hired a psychologist specialized in grief and trauma to help him, but what helped the most was Michael's constant presence. The boy had become Daniel's unofficial little therapist. Every morning, Michael would knock on the guest apartment door and invite Daniel to have breakfast. They developed small rituals. Michael would show the new signs he had learned, and Daniel would share stories about Emily through sign language. It was during one of these morning conversations that Daniel told Michael about Emily's artistic talent. "She painted the most beautiful things," Daniel signed. "She said she saw colors where others saw only silence." Michael was fascinated by the idea. "Can I see a drawing of hers?" Daniel was quiet for a moment. "I don't have anything of hers anymore. I lost everything when I lost the house." Michael thought for a moment and then made a proposal that surprised everyone. "Can we make a drawing for her?" "What do you mean?" "You tell me what she was like and I draw. That way you can have a new memory of her." The idea touched Daniel deeply. Over the following days, he began sharing memories of Emily with Michael. The boy, who had discovered a natural talent for drawing during his occupational therapy sessions, began creating illustrations based on Daniel's stories. The first drawing was of Emily dancing, based on Daniel's description of her last performance. Michael captured not just the figure of a young dancer, but also the joy and freedom that Daniel described when talking about his daughter. When Daniel saw the drawing, he cried. But they weren't tears of pure pain like before. They were tears of gratitude, of loving memories, of a father remembering the joy his daughter had brought to the world. "You have a gift," Michael, Daniel signed. Just like your mother had a gift for music. It was the first time Michael had heard someone talk about his mother without looks of pity or discomfort. Daniel spoke of Emily and Michael's mother as people who had left legacies of love, not just tragedies. Daddy told me that Mommy played the piano, Michael signed. She played beautifully. Her music made people happy. Do you think she would like my drawings? I'm sure she would be very proud. This conversation marked a turning point for Michael. He began to draw not just for Daniel, but as a way to honor his mother's memory. He created illustrations of his memories with her, of the house they lived in before the accident, of the piano she used to play. Richard watched these interactions with growing admiration. Daniel wasn't just recovering, he was helping Michael process his own pain in a way that professional therapists hadn't managed. 2 weeks after Daniel moved into the house, Rachel organized a visit to the school where she worked. The principal, Mrs. Margaret, was a woman of about 60 who had dedicated her life to teaching children with special needs. Rachel told me about your work with sign language, she said to Daniel during the meeting. We are developing a program for children who have both hearing impairments and emotional trauma. Your experience would be invaluable. Daniel was nervous, but Michael insisted on accompanying him on the visit to give moral support. During the school tour, Michael naturally fit in with the children, communicating through signs and showing them his drawings. A girl of about 9 years old, named Sophie, was sitting alone in a corner of the room. Rachel Collins explained that Sophie had lost her hearing in a car accident that also resulted in the loss of her parents. She was being raised by her grandmother, but had become very withdrawn. Michael, without any prompting from the adults, approached Sophie and showed her one of his drawings, the one he had made of Emily dancing. Through simple signs, he explained that the drawing was of a young lady who had also passed away but was remembered with love. Sophie became interested in the drawing and began asking questions. Within minutes, Michael and Sophie were chatting animatedly in signs, sharing stories about loved ones who were no longer with them. Daniel observed the interaction with tears in his eyes. That was exactly what Emily would have done. She would have used her own experience of loss to help other children not feel alone in their pain. When can you start? Mrs. Margaret asked Daniel at the end of the visit. 3 months later, Daniel had become an integral part of the school's team. He developed innovative methods to help deaf children who were also dealing with trauma, combining sign language with art therapy and emotional processing techniques. Michael continued to be his unofficial assistant. Every Wednesday after regular school, he went to the special school to help with the art activities. His natural ability to connect with other children who had experienced loss made him an extraordinary little therapist. Richard Sullivan watched these changes with joy and amazement. His son had not only regained the ability to communicate, but had found a purpose, helping other children through his art and his experience. The Sullivan home had also been transformed. Daniel had dinner with them at least 3 times a week, and their table conversations were a fascinating mix of English and sign language. Richard had become fluent enough to participate in these conversations and discovered that learning a new form of communication had also changed his perspective on many things. One day, 6 months after the first meeting in the square, Michael made an announcement that surprised everyone. "I want to learn to play the piano," he signed during dinner. Richard was moved. His son's mother's piano had remained closed and silent since the accident. Richard had never had the courage to sell it, but he also couldn't look at it without feeling pain. "Are you sure?" Richard asked. "I want to play the songs Mommy liked, for her, for Emily, and for other children who are sad." Daniel smiled through tears. "Emily would be very happy to know you want to use music to help others." Richard hired a piano teacher who also knew sign language. Michael's lessons progressed quickly, and in no time he was playing simple but beautiful melodies. The first impromptu concert took place at Mrs. Margaret's school. Michael played a simplified version of Für Elise, while Daniel interpreted the music in signs for the deaf children. It was a magical moment that left everyone present emotional. Sophie, the girl Michael had met on the first day, approached him after the performance. "How did you learn to turn sadness into music?" she asked through signs. Michael thought for a moment before answering. "A friend taught me that when we miss someone special, We can do beautiful things to honor that person. The music makes Mommy and Emily smile wherever they are." Michael's response spread throughout the school and soon reached the ears of other children's parents. Many began to ask if Michael could play for their children too. And so the project Music and Signs was born, a weekly program where Michael played the piano while Daniel interpreted the songs in sign language. The program was open not only to deaf children, but to any child dealing with loss or trauma. The first public performance took place in the school auditorium, but soon the program grew so much that they had to move to larger spaces. Michael, now 9 years old and much more confident, not only played the piano but also sang some songs. His voice was different from what it was before the accident, more mature, more emotional, carrying an experience that children his age rarely possess. But it was beautiful and touching, in a way that moved everyone who heard it. Richard Sullivan watched these performances with his heart overflowing with pride and gratitude. His son had not only recovered from the trauma, but had found a way to transform his pain into something that brought joy and healing to other people. During one of the performances, Richard noticed a woman in the audience who was crying silently. She was accompanied by a girl of about 7 who appeared to have some kind of developmental disability. After the show, the woman approached Richard. "My name is Amanda," she introduced herself. "This is my daughter, Emma. She has autism and never showed any interest in music before today. Throughout the entire performance, she was completely focused. It was the first time I saw her so attentive to something." Richard was moved. "Michael will be very happy to hear that. You have no idea of the gift you gave us today," Amanda continued. "Em lost her father last year, and since then, it has been very difficult to connect with her. But today, during the music, she held my hand and smiled. Stories like this became common." Families came from other cities to watch Michael and Daniel's performances. Letters arrived, telling how the music and signs had touched people who seemed lost in their own worlds of pain. 1 year after the first meeting in the square, Richard decided to organize a special party. He invited all the people who had become part of his new extended family: Rachel Collins, Mrs. Margaret, Mrs. Eleanor and Ethan, Jennifer, who came from Los Angeles, all the students from the special school, and of course Daniel. The party took place in the garden of the Sullivan house, decorated with Michael's drawings and photographs from the performances. In the center of the garden, Richard had installed a discreet but beautiful memorial: 2 small plaques with the names of Michael's mother and Emily, surrounded by flowers and a small fountain. "I want to make a toast," Richard said, standing up with a glass of juice in his hand, since most of the guests were children. "1 year ago, I was a desperate father who had lost not only his wife but also the connection with his son. Today, I have not only my son back, but a family much larger than I imagined possible." Everyone applauded, but Richard wasn't finished. "Daniel, you came into our lives disguised as a beggar, but in reality you were an angel. You not only saved Michael, but you taught me that sometimes the solutions to our problems come from the most unexpected places." Daniel was visibly moved. "Richard, you saved me as much as I saved you. You gave me a reason to live again." Michael stood up and asked for attention through signs. "I want to say something." He signed, but this time he also spoke aloud so everyone could understand. "Before I met Daniel, I thought that when someone we love goes away, we have to be sad forever. But he taught me that we can transform longing into something beautiful. We can use our sadness to help other people who are also sad." The boy looked at the memorial in the center of the garden. "Mom and Emily are no longer here, but they live in every song I play, in every drawing I make, and in every child we manage to help smile again." Michael then did something that surprised everyone. He walked over to the piano that Richard had brought into the garden, especially for the party. He sat down and began to play a melody that nobody recognized immediately. Daniel noticed first and began to interpret in sign language. It was a song he had composed together with Michael, based on a tune Emily used to sing when she was little. They had worked on the composition for weeks, combining Daniel's memories with Michael's growing musical talent. As Michael played, Daniel not only interpreted in signs but also told the story through gestures. It was the story of two families who had lost loved ones, but who found a new form of family in each other. When the song ended, there wasn't a dry eye in the garden. Even the young children understood they had witnessed something special. Sophie, the girl from school who had become close to Michael, approached and asked a question through signs. How do we know when someone who has passed away is proud of us? Michael smiled and pointed to the flowers around the memorial, which seemed to dance gently in the afternoon breeze. I think they always find a way to tell us. As the party continued, Richard observed the interactions around him. Jennifer was teaching sign language to some of the children. Rachel was chatting animatedly with Mrs. Margaret about new programs for the school. Mrs. Eleanor and Ethan were helping Michael organize a small, impromptu concert with some of the children, and Daniel was sitting in a corner, drawing in a notebook Michael had given him. Richard approached to see what he was creating. It was a drawing of the party, but seen through the eyes of someone who had learned to see beauty even after great loss. It showed all the people gathered, connected not just by being in the same place, but by invisible lines of care, understanding, and love. It's beautiful, Richard commented. Michael taught me that every family started with strangers who decided to care about each other, Daniel explained. This drawing is about our chosen family. Richard felt a lump in his throat. You know you'll always have a place here, don't you? I know. And you will always have a place in my heart. As the evening wore on and guests began to leave, Richard reflected on how his life had completely changed. A year ago, he was a successful businessman, but a failed father who had lost the connection with his only son. Today, he was part of a community that extended far beyond his biological family. Michael had not only regained the ability to speak and connect with others, but had become a little healer, using his music and art to help other children dealing with loss and trauma. Daniel had found not just a new career, but a new purpose. His innovative methods at the special school were gaining national recognition, and he had been invited to present his work at special education conferences across the country. More important than any of that, they had created something Richard had never imagined possible, a family that honored the people they had lost, not through perpetual sadness, but through active love and care for others who needed help. 3 months after the party, Michael made another surprising announcement. I want to learn to work with other children when I grow up, he said during dinner, like Daniel does. What kind of work? Richard asked. I want to be a doctor who helps sad children become happy again, but not with medicine, with music and drawings and play. Daniel smiled. This is called play therapy. It's a very beautiful specialty. Then that's what I want to do. I want to help children like Sophie, like I was before. Richard and Daniel exchanged meaningful looks. Michael had found not only his voice, but also his vocation. In the following months, Michael began to practice his future career. During visits to the special school, he watched attentively how Daniel worked with the children. He asked questions, took notes in his sketchbook, and proposed new activities. One of his innovations was the creation of emotion cards, simple drawings that represented different feelings, allowing nonverbal children to communicate how they felt. The idea was so successful that Mrs. Margaret decided to implement it throughout the school. Another project of Michael's was the Memory Garden, a space in the schoolyard where children who had lost loved ones could plant flowers or small plants in their honor. Each plant had a small plaque with the name of the person remembered and a word describing what they meant to the child. The garden became a place of healing and reflection, where children could process their grief in a tangible and constructive way. Michael often brought his guitar, he had expanded his musical studies, to play softly while the children tended to their plants. A year and a half after the first meeting in the square, Richard received a call that would change everything again. It was from Dr. Stephen, the psychiatrist who had treated Michael initially. Mr. Sullivan, I'm calling because I would like to apologize, Dr. Stephen said. I heard about the work that Michael and Mr. Daniel are doing, and I must admit I was completely wrong about your son's treatment. Richard was surprised. Doctor, there's no need to apologize. You did the best you could with the information you had. No, Mr. Sullivan. I was so focused on protocols and conventional treatments that I lost sight of what really mattered, the human connection. I would like to know if it would be possible to visit the work you are doing. I believe I can learn a lot. Dr. Stevens' visit was an important moment of validation for the entire program. As a respected specialist in the field, his approval and interest helped legitimize the unconventional methods that Daniel and Michael had developed. "It's extraordinary," Dr. Stephen commented after observing a session. "You have created something that traditional medicine struggles to achieve, true emotional healing through authentic connection." Dr. Stephen became a valuable ally, helping to document and formalize the methods developed at the school so they could be replicated elsewhere. 2 years after the first meeting, the story of Michael and Daniel had spread far beyond New York City. Journalists came to interview the unlikely family that was revolutionizing the treatment of childhood trauma. A special report on national television showed Michael, now 10 years old, playing piano and singing for an auditorium full of families affected by various forms of trauma and loss. Daniel was beside him, interpreting every note in sign language with a grace and beauty that turned the music into visual art. The report also showed the memory garden, now expanded to include a small amphitheater where regular performances took place. Hundreds of plants flourished in the space, each one representing a life remembered with love. What began as a personal tragedy has turned into a source of healing for hundreds of families, the reporter said. Michael Sullivan and Daniel Matthews have proven that sometimes the greatest miracles come from the most unlikely encounters. During the interview, Michael was asked what advice he would give to other children dealing with loss. "Don't be afraid to feel sad," he answered, with an impressive maturity for his age. "Sadness isn't bad. It's our way of honoring the people we love. But also don't be afraid to feel joy again. The people who left would want us to be happy." Daniel was asked how he had found the strength to continue after losing Emily. "I didn't find the strength alone," he answered honestly. "Michael and Richard showed me that pain can be transformed into purpose. Emily always dreamed of making the world more beautiful through art. Now, through the work we do, she continues to do that." The report had a national impact. Donations came from all over the country to expand the program. Schools in other cities asked for help to implement similar methods. And most importantly, families who felt lost in their own pain found hope. Among the letters that arrived, one particularly touched Richard. It was from a mother in Boston whose daughter had lost her speech after witnessing an accident. She had watched the report and decided to try similar methods with her daughter. "Mr. Richard," the letter said, "I cannot thank you enough for sharing your story. My daughter Abigail hadn't spoken in 6 months. After seeing the program, I started learning sign language with her. Yesterday, for the first time since the accident, she smiled. It was the most beautiful smile in the world. You gave us our daughter back." Letters like this arrived weekly, each one telling a story of renewed hope and restored connections. 3 years after the first meeting in the square, Michael had become a minor national celebrity, but Richard made a point of keeping him grounded. He continued attending a regular school, had household responsibilities, and needed to keep his grades high. But Michael had also matured in ways that constantly surprised him. He developed an impressive intuition for identifying children who were dealing with trauma, even when the adults around them didn't notice. During a presentation in Washington, D.C., Michael noticed a boy at the back of the auditorium who seemed disconnected from what was happening around him. During the intermission, he approached the family and gently started a conversation. They discovered that the boy Alex had stopped speaking after his parents' separation. No one had identified it as trauma because the separation had been friendly, but Michael recognized the signs immediately. "Sometimes people think that if there are no fights or violence, children don't get hurt," Michael explained to Alex's parents. "But losing the family we knew always hurts, even when it's necessary." With the help of Michael and Daniel, Alex found his voice again in a matter of weeks. His parents implemented techniques they learned to help him process the changes in his family life. Stories like this reinforced Richard's belief that Michael had truly found his calling. But more important than that, Michael had learned to use his own experience of pain to create genuine connections with other people who were suffering. Daniel also continued to grow professionally. He had completed refresher courses and regained his license to work with children. He was invited to lecture at universities about alternative methods of child therapy. But what was most significant for Daniel was when he decided to write a book about his journey. Not a technical manual, but a personal memoir about how loss can be transformed into purpose. "Emily always wanted me to write," he told Richard while working on the manuscript. "She said I had important stories to tell." The book, titled From Silence to Healing, A Father's Journey to Father, became a national bestseller. Daniel donated all his royalties to expand the alternative therapy program in public schools. 5 years after the first meeting in the square, the Sullivan-Matthews family, as they were known in the media, had created a national movement. The Michael and Daniel method was being implemented in schools across every state in the country. More important than the public recognition was the personal impact on their lives. Richard had become not just a better father, but a more complete man. Learning sign language had taught him to truly listen, not just with his ears, but with his heart. Michael, now 13, had become a confident and compassionate teenager, but he still maintained the special sensitivity that made him so effective at helping other children. He continued his regular studies, but also studied child psychology and music therapy through special programs. Daniel had found not just a new career, but a new identity. He was no longer the man destroyed by loss, but someone who had transformed his painful experience into a source of healing for hundreds of other families. During an awards ceremony, where they received national recognition for their humanitarian work, Michael was invited to give a speech. "When I was little and I stopped speaking, I thought I would never be happy again," he said to an audience of hundreds of people. "I thought that when someone we love leaves, our joy leaves with them." Michael paused and looked at Richard and Daniel in the audience. "But Daniel taught me something very important. Missing someone isn't the end of joy. It's the beginning of a different joy. The joy of honoring those who have left through how we choose to live." He gestured to the audience, which included dozens of families who had been touched by the program. "Everyone here has lost someone or something important. But look around. See how we've transformed our pain into something that helps others. See how our sadness has become the strength to create beauty in the world." Michael concluded his speech with words that became the informal motto of the movement. "The greatest tribute we can pay to those who have left is to use our love for them to love better those who are still here." The audience rose in a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. But Richard knew that the real prize wasn't in the applause or the recognition. It was in the fact that his son had found not only his voice but his purpose. After the ceremony, as they were heading home, Michael asked a question that surprised Richard. "Dad, do you think Mom would be proud of us?" Richard smiled, thinking of the loving and musically talented woman who had raised Michael with such care. "I'm absolutely sure, son. She would be proud not only of who you've become, but of how you use your talents to care for others." Michael nodded, satisfied, and then looked at Daniel. "And Emily? Do you think she would be happy with what we're doing?" Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, visualizing the daughter he had lost so many years before. "Emily always believed that art could heal the world," he replied. "Through you, Michael. She continues to do exactly that." 6 years after the first meeting in the square, Richard decided to do something special. He organized a ceremony to officially adopt Daniel as a member of the Sullivan family. "You've been family for years," Richard said to Daniel while preparing the paperwork. "This just makes official what our hearts already know." The ceremony was small and intimate, held in the garden of the house where everything had begun to transform. Michael played the piano, performing a song he had composed especially for the occasion, a melody that told the story of 2 broken families that had become one whole family. After the ceremony, they visited the memorial they had created for Michael's mother and Emily. The plants around them had grown and flourished, creating a lush garden full of life. "Look how much it's grown," Michael observed. "It's as if they're happy we're all together." Richard Sullivan hugged the 2 most important men in his life: his son, who had found his voice and his purpose, and Daniel, who had become the brother he never had. "Do you know what the most incredible part of all this is?" Richard said. "When this all started, I was desperate to fix Michael. But in reality, there was nothing to fix. Michael just needed to find a new way to express himself. "And I needed to find a new reason to live," Daniel added. "You both gave me that." Michael looked at the two men who had become his heroes and mentors. "And I learned that family isn't just who you're born with. It's who chooses to stay with you, especially when things get tough." 7 years after their first meeting, Michael was about to turn 15. He had become an articulate and compassionate young man, fluent in both English and sign language, and talented in both music and visual art. But what was most impressive was his ability to connect with people of all ages who were dealing with some kind of pain or loss. He had developed an almost supernatural intuition for identifying when someone needed help, even when the person didn't ask for it explicitly. During a trip to launch the program in New England schools, Michael met a 70-year-old grandmother who had recently lost her husband and was raising 2 orphaned grandchildren. "I don't know how to smile anymore," she confessed to Michael during a conversation after his presentation. "I've lost so many important people. How do you all keep finding joy?" Michael, now with a maturity that impressed much older adults, replied kindly, "Mrs. Grace, you don't have to pretend you're not in pain. Grief is love with no place to go. But you can turn that love into care for your grandchildren. They need to see that it's possible to be sad and happy at the same time." The simplicity and depth of his answer touched not only Mrs. Grace, but everyone who heard it. That's what made Michael so special, his ability to express complex truths in a simple and accessible way. Daniel watched these interactions with growing admiration. Michael had become what Emily had always dreamed of being, someone who used his talents to heal the world, one person at a time. "He's exceeded even my most optimistic expectations," Daniel commented to Richard during the trip back to New York City. Michael didn't just recover from the trauma. He transformed into a natural healer. "And you?" Richard asked. "How do you feel about all this?" Daniel thought for a moment. "Grateful, at peace. For the first time since I lost Emily, I feel my life has purpose again. Not just professional purpose, but personal purpose." "Emily would be proud," Richard said. "I'm sure she would, and your wife would be proud of Michael, too." The two men looked at Michael, who was sleeping in the seat beside them, his face relaxed and peaceful. It was hard to imagine that this confident, compassionate young man had once been a child, lost in his own silence. 8 years after the first meeting in the square, Michael made a decision that surprised everyone. He decided to dedicate his last year of high school to writing a book about his experience. "I want to tell our story," he explained to Richard and Daniel. "Not just my story, but our story. How 3 people who seemed to have nothing in common found a family in each other." Michael's book, titled "The Day Silence Found Its Voice," was written with Daniel's help, who contributed chapters about his own journey of loss and recovery. Unlike Daniel's technical book, this was a personal and emotional narrative that captured not just the facts of his story, but the feelings, the doubts, the hopes, and the moments of pure joy they had experienced along the way. The book became a national phenomenon, touching readers of all ages, but the most significant was its impact on other families dealing with trauma and loss. Letters arrived daily from parents who had implemented the techniques described in the book, from children who felt less alone in their pain, from teachers who had adapted the methods for their classrooms. One letter in particular touched Michael deeply. It was from an 8-year-old girl named Lily, who had lost the grandmother who raised her. "Dear Michael," the letter said in careful, childlike handwriting, "I read your book with my new adoptive mommy. You taught me that I don't have to stop loving my grandma just because she's not here anymore. I'm learning to play the piano to play the songs she liked. Thank you so much for teaching me that sadness and happiness can live in the same heart." Letters like this confirmed for Michael that he had chosen the right path. He had decided to study psychology with a specialization in child therapy, following in Daniel's footsteps. "I want to be for other children what Daniel was for me," Michael explained during an interview about his college plans. "I want to help families find their own ways to heal." Richard watched these interviews with a heart full of pride and gratitude. His son had become not just the young man he had dreamed he would be, but so much more. Michael had found a life mission that used his personal experience to benefit countless other people. 9 years after the first meeting in the square, the family received news that moved them deeply. Michael had been accepted into one of the best universities in the country with a full scholarship to study psychology. But even more significant was the invitation he received to give a speech at his high school graduation ceremony. At 17, Michael would be the main speaker at his own graduation. Michael's speech was broadcast nationally and went viral on social media. He spoke about resilience, about chosen family, and about how the greatest tragedies can turn into the greatest blessings if we allow it to happen. 9 years ago, I was a broken child who had lost not only my mother, but also the ability to connect with the world, Michael said to an audience of hundreds of families. Today, I am here not in spite of that experience, but because of it. He looked directly at Richard and Daniel in the audience. My family taught me that healing doesn't mean forgetting the pain. It means learning to carry the pain in a way that makes us stronger, more compassionate, more able to help others. Michael concluded his speech with a promise that touched everyone present. I promise to use my education, my talents, and my experience to continue helping families who are going through what we went through, because I believe that every child deserves to find their voice, no matter how long it takes. After the ceremony, the 3 generations of the Sullivan-Matthews family gathered for an intimate celebration. Richard, now with graying hair but a face that radiated contentment, Daniel, who had become a respected expert in his field, and Michael, ready to begin the next phase of his journey. You know what's the most amazing thing about all of this? Richard said as they toasted with soda in the garden where everything had begun to transform. If someone had told me 9 years ago that I would be here today with you two, celebrating everything we built together, I would never have believed it. Life has a funny way of surprising us, Daniel agreed. Sometimes the worst things that happen to us end up leading to the best. Michael smiled, looking at the memorial they had created for his mother and Emily. The plants were more lush than ever, creating a garden that was both a tribute to the past and a celebration of the future. I think they were happy for us, Michael said simply. We turned our sadness for them into joy for other people. Richard Sullivan hugged his son and his adoptive brother, feeling a gratitude so deep he could hardly put it into words. We are living proof that family isn't just about blood, he said. It's about choosing to love and care for each other, especially when it's hard. And about turning pain into purpose, Daniel added. And about never giving up on each other, Michael finished. End of story. And now, dear listeners, we have come to the end of this emotional journey. What did you think of Michael's transformation and the family that formed in such an unexpected way? Can you imagine how a chance encounter can change lives forever? Share your thoughts on this story of love, loss, and renewal in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more heart-touching stories.